I've mentioned previously how poltergeist cases fascinate and terrify me in equal measure, because they feel less like stories and more like something that happens to people, ordinary people, in ordinary homes, with no warning and no explanation. Poltergeists have always stood apart from the classic ghost story. These aren't the traditional ghostly figures witnessed at the foot of your bed in the wee small hours, or the distant sobs heard in a castle corridor. Poltergeists are noisy, disruptive, and often violent. They throw things, bang on walls, and, in the most frightening accounts, seem to focus on an agent, one person, as if drawn to them. The word itself comes from German, poltern meaning to make noise or to rattle, and Geist meaning ghost or spirit, a noisy ghost. It's a fitting name for a phenomenon reported for centuries. One that tends to appear suddenly, escalate fast, and then vanish without warning. Some researchers traced the first documented poltergeist case back to the 9th century, in the German town of Bingen, where a bishop recorded disturbances involving flying stones and mysterious voices. But many point to the famous Drummer of Tedworth case in England in 1661 as the first well-documented account. There, a magistrate seized a drummer's instrument, and soon after his home was plagued by loud banging, strange music, and unexplained activity. Since then, the pattern has remained strikingly consistent. Sudden, often violent sounds, objects thrown or moved without cause, and, more often than that, a young person at the centre of it all. I've covered a few poltergeist cases on this channel already, from perhaps my favourite account, the terrifying events at Rerrick and Dumfries in Galloway, to the strange case of the Dag poltergeist in rural Canada, where a small family was besieged by knocks, flying objects, and voices calling from empty rooms. Across all of these stories, a rough pattern starts to emerge, one I've mentioned before. Writer and parapsychologist Evelyn Hollow describes it as the 7 stages of poltergeist activity, beginning with a build-up of tension, followed by minor incidents, escalation, a peak of violent or bizarre events, decline, and finally an end. But the thing that fascinates me the most is how rarely these cases follow a tidy arc. The stages can loop, restart, or blur together, and the so-called end often leaves more questions than answers. Some researchers have tried to frame poltergeist cases in psychological terms, as externalized manifestations of stress, grief, or repressed emotions, often centered on kids or those undergoing change. Others view them as a type of psychic storm, some kind of natural energy, focused and directed, but not fully understood. Whether seen as paranormal, psychological, or something stranger still, poltergeist cases sit in a strange space between haunting and hysteria, between explanation and experience. But tonight's story is different. It didn't unfold in a remote farmhouse or centuries-old cottage. It happened in a flat, a perfectly ordinary second-floor flat in Paisley, just outside Glasgow. And unlike other famous cases, it didn't make the newspapers. No journalists arrived. No investigators came calling. It remained a local story, largely forgotten, except by those who lived through it. This is the story of the Glenburn poltergeist. Paisley sits just a few miles from Glasgow, but it has its own identity. For a long time it was known for thread and textiles, especially the Paisley pattern, which became famous around the world. The mills brought jobs and growth, then decline. Like so many industrial towns across Scotland, what's left is a place with strong communities, old buildings, and a history that still feels close. At the centre of the town is Paisley Abbey, first founded in the 1100s. It's seen hundreds of years of change, royal visits, religious upheaval, and in 1697, one of the last mass witch trials in Europe. The story of the Paisley witches still casts a shadow over the town. It began with a young girl's accusation and ended with 6 people hanged and burned, their remains buried at a crossroads under a horseshoe-shaped stone, which is still there to this day. Paisley is a place where ghost stories don't always make headlines, but they do happen, and they're passed on from neighbour to neighbour. So when something strange started happening in a flat in Glenburn in 1977, people noticed. Not because it made the papers straight away, but because of the impact it had on those involved. In the summer of 1977, a 13-year-old boy named Alan lived with his mother in a second-floor flat on Glenburn Road, a quiet residential stretch of Paisley. It was the kind of place where neighbours nodded to each other on the stairs, and where families knew the routines of those who lived nearby, who came home when, who played music too loud, whose dog barked at the postie. Alan's mum's flat was nothing out the ordinary, modest and lived in. Like many in the block, it backed onto other flats, with a layout that made most of the limited space. Above his bedroom was an attic, dusty, locked, and rarely thought about. But something changed that summer. Slowly at first. Alan would be lying in bed at night when he'd hear it. A faint scratching sound, like something shifting across the ceiling. Too steady to be pipes, too deliberate to be dismissed. His mother heard it too. This didn't happen every night, but it was often enough that they started to mention it to each other. Half laughing at first, then more uneasy as the sounds grew louder. What began as scratching soon turned into knocking, then thudding, as if someone was walking back and forth in the space above Alan's room. Not just walking, but pacing, heavy footsteps that seemed to have purpose. They checked the attic, of course, more than once. Nothing up there but insulation and dust. No signs of animals, no loose boards. But the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Doors began to creak open on their own. Lights flickered and blew, even after new bulbs were fitted. Small objects, pens, books, bits of paper would go missing, only to turn up hours later in places neither Alan nor his mum remembered leaving them. Although understandably frightened, Alan tried his best to ignore it. So did his mum. But it became harder each night. The noises weren't random, they followed a pattern. They seemed to know when someone was alone or when the lights were out. It wasn't long before sleep became difficult, and both said they began to feel watched. Alan stopped inviting his friends round. His mum started keeping the radio on when she was alone, just to break the silence. There were no dramatic incidents, no levitating furniture, no smashed plates. But what was happening was enough to push both of them to the edge. Alan would later describe it as like being terrorised, not in a single event, but in a slow, wearing way. Like someone was inside the flat with them and wanted them to know it. That same year, over 300 miles away, the famous Enfield poltergeist case was making headlines. Police officers, journalists and paranormal investigators were camped outside the Hodgson home in London, documenting every moment, every knock. Glenburn was different. No newspapers ran stories, no researchers rushed to document what was happening. The haunting remained local, just rumours. And in some ways that made it worse. There was no one to explain it, no one to believe it, only a mother and son, alone in a small flat, trying their best to understand what had taken root in their home. Alan's own account gives us the clearest picture of events inside the flat. According to his later testimony, the strange activity always began around 11:30 p.m, just as the rest of the building was settling down for the night. It would start small, a faint scratching sound, easy to dismiss at first. He couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, the walls, the ceilings, the space behind the headboard. But it would continue for hours, steady and persistent. He'd lay awake night after night, trying to convince himself it was just pipes or mice. Then, about a week after it began, the noises changed. Alan described it as like claws being dragged down the wall, just inches from where he slept. As if a big cat was sharpening its claws, he said. Only there was no movement, no shadow, nothing visible. Just the sound, low and deliberate, and the growing sense that whatever was making it was getting closer to him. Not long after, the disturbance escalated again. One night, a new sound began, loud thumping, and what he could only describe as marching in the attic above his bedroom. He remembers turning to his mother in panic. It was so loud, it was like an army marching between the rafters, back and forth, he said. The ceiling shook with the force of it. His mother heard it too. We were both so scared we stayed in the living room all night, Alan recalled. Neither of them dared to go up to the attic. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Most nights between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m, the household was hit by knocks, scratches, and the same heavy footsteps pacing back and forth. Alan said the experience wore him down. He became exhausted, anxious, and began to question his own grip on things. Am I going mad? He asked himself more than once. Then came something even more disturbing. After about 3 weeks of unexplained noises and disturbed nights, something changed. Up until then, the disturbances had been sound-based. Frightening, yes, but invisible. However, one night Alan witnessed something. He was lying in bed, trying to stay calm, when movement caught his eye. A figure, black as pitch, a solid figure, the shape of a rather fat man, began to move across his bedroom wall. It didn't walk or stumble, it seemed to glide, silent and deliberate. The silhouette passed right over the posters above his bed, flat as a shadow but too defined to dismiss his imagination. It looked two-dimensional, Alan later said, like a paper cutout, but it moved with intent. Something about the way it moved was wrong, too smooth, too steady. It wasn't flickering like a trick of the light, it didn't vanish or fade, it simply crossed the wall, as if it belonged there. I screamed at the top of my voice for my mum, he said. By the time she got to the room, the figure was gone. Nothing was disturbed, but Alan was in pieces. That sighting marked a turning point. He refused to sleep in his bedroom for several nights after, choosing instead to stay in the living room, closer to his mum, where the light could be left on. The fear didn't wear off, it settled in. He later said he felt like something had been watching him for weeks, and now it had finally decided to show itself. Whatever had been scratching, marching, and thumping its way through the flat, now had a shape. Alan's mother backed up his story, particularly the noises. I could hear it too, she said, of the thumping in the attic. But strangely, no neighbours in the building are known to have reported anything. It's possible they didn't hear it, it's also possible they chose to ignore it, or simply chalked it up to ordinary tenement sounds. What we're left with is a case largely confined to one flat, or at least one family willing to speak about it. And it's Alan's voice, years later, that gives us the most complete account of what took place inside. As the nights dragged on, Alan and his mother grew desperate. The disturbances weren't letting up, in fact they were getting worse. The scratching, as we know, had become thumping, and the thumping had become pounding. Some nights felt like the ceiling may come down. Then came one night that pushed them beyond their limit. The noise overhead was deafening. Footsteps banging, movement that felt angry. Alan and his mum sat frozen in the living room, waiting for it to pass. But it didn't. The pounding continued, relentless, They couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing their coats, they left the flat and walked out into the rain. There was nowhere else to go, so they turned to the only source of help they could think of, the church. The family was Catholic, so they made their way through the wet streets to the local rectory. Alan remembers being soaked through, cold, exhausted, and at breaking point. They knocked on the door, a light came on, and a priest appeared. But instead of comfort, they were met with scorn. He didn't invite them in, he didn't ask questions. He stood in the doorway, listened to their pleas, and told them bluntly, "Stop wasting my time and go home." Then he shut the door. Alan was stunned. Mum was speechless. As for himself, the rejection hit hard. For a second I wanted to walk in front of a car, just so it would all stop. They made their way home, drenched and shaken, with nowhere else to turn. The church had refused them. There would be no blessing, no intervention, just more nights of waiting and hoping the worst was behind them. From that point on, they stopped sleeping in separate rooms. They brought blankets into the living room and stayed close. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. Alan tried to reason with himself. They hadn't been harmed, not physically at least. If we ignored it, he told himself, maybe it would go away. The thing, whatever it was, never attacked them directly, but it didn't have to. The sounds alone were enough, the fear, the exhaustion, the strain. It never actually attacked us, Alan later said. It did more than enough damage by the sounds it made. Up to this point, only Alan and his mother had experienced the disturbances. And while they had no doubt about what was happening, they also knew how it must have sounded to others. Alan wasn't sure who would believe him. But that changed when a group of his school friends volunteered to stay over and see for themselves. It was a decision that led to one of the most frightening moments in the entire case, but crucially gave the story new witnesses. Alan invited 4 of them, Marie, Susan, Glenn and Scott, to stay the night in his bedroom. It was about a month into the activity. Of the group, Glenn was the skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts and made that clear. The others were more nervous but curious. They arrived around 10:30 p.m, chatting, laughing, trying to settle their nerves. Alan didn't sugarcoat what might happen. If you want to leave, he told them, now would be the best time. He'd started to notice the activity had a pattern, and if it held, something would begin around 11:30. And he was right. Almost exactly on schedule, the first sound began. A faint rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls. The group fell silent. The laughter and nervous chatter stopped. No one wanted to be the first to say they'd heard it. Then the tapping grew louder, heavier, as if something was knocking, not on wood, but through it. Within minutes, the pounding then started. The familiar, thunderous footsteps Alan knew only too well. They moved back and forth across the attic above them, slow, deliberate and angry. Everyone in the room could see the ceiling panels trembling with the force of it, as if footsteps were pushing the flimsy joists above. The floor above them wasn't meant to move, but it did. Dust drifted from the ceiling edges. One of the posters fluttered on the wall. The sound didn't echo like a building creaking or pipe settling. It came in bursts, like something pacing hard, turning and pacing again. Alan glanced around the room. His friends' faces were drawn tight. Even Glenn, the skeptic, was visibly shaking. No jokes now. His face had gone pale, eyes wide, jaw clenched. He was gripping the edge of the bed, staring up at the ceiling as if expecting it to cave in. No one spoke. The room was filled with the pounding overhead and the shallow, quick breaths of 5 frightened teenagers. Then came 3 distinct knocks, louder than anything before. No footsteps, but something closer, direct. Alan described it as 3 sharp bangs, like it was right above us, like it knew we were listening. That was the moment everything changed. That was enough for Glenn. He panicked. He lunged for the door and yanked it open, or tried to. The knob came off in his hand. The old door hardware broke, jamming the door shut. They were trapped. With the pounding still raging overhead and the door stuck, Glenn completely lost control. Convinced the devil was after him, he did the only thing he could think to do. He jumped. He threw open the window and leapt from the 2nd floor to escape whatever was in that room. He broke his leg when he hit the ground. The others, still inside, were frozen for a second. No one had expected Glenn to jump. Then panic set in. They scrambled to the door, yanking and pushing until the old frame finally gave way, burst open with a crack, and they rushed out to the landing. Down below, Glenn was lying in the garden, groaning in pain, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He was conscious but pale and shaking. They didn't know what else to do, and so they called for an ambulance. Paramedics arrived quickly. They stabilised Glenn and got him into the back of the vehicle. Alan watched as the flashing lights disappeared down the street, taking his friend away. In the official records, it was simple. A teenage boy had fallen from a 2nd-story window and broken his leg. A household accident, nothing more. The ambulance report would mention the injury, the location, maybe even the time, but not the pounding, not the shadow. Not the way the ceiling had bowed with invisible footsteps just minutes before. The fear, the real reason Glenn had jumped, wouldn't appear anywhere in paperwork. No one asked. And even if they had, would any of them have dared to say it out loud? Alan never forgot the look on Glenn's face before he bolted. It wasn't confusion or drama, it was pure, unfiltered terror, the kind you can't fake. Something had broken inside him at that moment, and the only thing his body could think to do was get out, even if it meant jumping through a window. It was the kind of moment that left no proof, but it left a scar all the same. At 13, telling a nurse or a doctor that you jumped out a window because of a ghost probably wasn't an option. The incident had a lasting impact. It remains one of the most widely cited events in the Glenburn case, not just because of the injury, but because it brought multiple witnesses. At least 4 other people now had their own experience of the strange happenings inside the flat. The story was no longer just Alan's. After that night, Alan's mother banned all future sleepovers. It wasn't a risk she was willing to take again. One friend, Marie, continued to visit. She seemed more fascinated than afraid. Alan later said that her calmness helped him cope during some of the worst moments, but from then on, the flat felt even more charged. Something had been witnessed, and it had nearly ended in tragedy. Then just as suddenly as it began, the haunting stopped. After around 4 to 5 weeks of nearly nightly activity, the sounds, the shadow, the fear, it faded. There was no final confrontation, no explanation. One night, the pounding simply didn't return. The scratching, the footsteps, the thuds in the attic, all of it just stopped. Life returned to something resembling normal. Alan and his mother hadn't moved out during the ordeal, though they'd seriously considered it on the worst nights. But once the disturbances ceased, they stayed. As far as records show, no further activity was reported at that address. The case had followed a familiar pattern seen in other poltergeist incidents. Intense, short-lived, and inexplicable, centred around a young person, then gone, without warning or closure. Looking back, Alan said he eventually overcame the fear. By the end, I was no longer scared, he wrote. The experience, while traumatic, had become something more than just a source of dread. He came to see it as proof, not necessarily of a ghost, but of something, a sign that there might be more to this world than what we see. It confirmed for me there's an afterlife, he said, that there are things beyond understanding. He didn't seek out more answers, he didn't try to revisit or investigate the flat in later years. Instead, he carried the experience with him, not as a mystery to solve, but as something deeply personal that changed how he saw the world. His mother's thoughts on it remain less known. She spoke less about what happened. But one imagines that, when the nights finally grew quiet again, she was simply grateful. Poltergeist cases are often remembered for their drama, the bangs, the shadows, the sudden bursts of terror in the night. But it's what comes after that haunts. Not the sounds, but the silence. Not the fear, but the questions. The Glenburn case followed a pattern familiar to anyone who's looked into this type of phenomena. A short, intense outbreak of strange and frightening events centred on a teenager. Then as quickly as it came, it was over. No explanation, no resolution, just memories. But when you place this in context, both geographically and emotionally, it starts to feel less like an isolated incident and more like the surface of something deeper. The area around Glenburn, like much of Renfrewshire, carries a darker history than it lets on. In the 17th century, this region was part of the witch panic that swept across Scotland. The Bargarin witch trials took place not far from here, a cluster of accusations and executions that left a permanent mark on the local psyche. Innocent people, many of them women and girls, were accused, imprisoned, and in some cases killed, often based on little more than fear, suspicion, and the words of a child. That kind of history doesn't just vanish, it seeps into the ground. But the most striking thing about this case isn't the banging or the shadow, it's the boy at the centre of it. Alan was 13 when it happened, an age when everything is shifting. You're old enough to feel adult emotions, but still young enough that no one expects you to carry them. We often think of childhood as protected time, but the truth is, many children are quietly carrying far more than we realise. Alan's experience makes me think about what young people internalise, the weight of unspoken grief, fear, or even anger. These emotions don't always come out in the ways we expect. In some cases, they don't come out at all, not in words at least. I don't claim to know what caused what happened in Glenburn. I believe Alan, not just that he was afraid, but that something real happened to him, something that left a mark. At the same time, I believe that when emotional stress has nowhere to go, it can find its own shape. It knocks, it marches, it glides across bedroom walls, and sometimes it breaks the silence in ways that frighten even the people living through it. We talk a lot about ghosts, the kind that drift through history, or appear at the foot of the bed. But maybe the ones that matter the most are the ones we grow up with, the ones that live inside us, the ones no one sees until it's already too late. And maybe, just maybe, this story isn't just about what haunted a flat in 1977. Maybe it's about what haunts us still.